Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome to this radio program Tony Award-winning playwright, author, performer, and activist V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, and also known for her work such as The Apology, I Am an Emotional Creature, and of course, the Vagina Monologues. V is also the founder of V-Day, the global activist movement to end violence against women and girls, and 1 Billion Rising, the largest global mass action to end gender-based violence in over 200 countries. She is the author of a new book, which is a collection of her writings over time. It's called Reckoning, and she joins us to talk about it. V, it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. I'm very happy to be with you today.
This book, Reckoning, comes out of the pandemic.
It does. It does indeed. I think, I wish we could say it's fully over, but it's not. But that's the height of it. For those of us who were privileged enough not to be on the front lines in hospitals and, serving people the way people so generously did, those of us who were kind of locked into our houses, I think it was a very profound, difficult, restless, but very deep period, certainly in my life, and I know for many, of reckoning in an across the board kind of way. I mean, reckoning for me personally, because I think we had so much time to sit and not kind of run past ourselves and travel and move but to really just go in and look at our past and look at our histories and look at I had a lot of ghosts running around, where I was and things to reckon with. At the same time, it seemed like the world was at our fingertips and there was massive reckonings going on, particularly in this country, in so many different directions, whether it was reckoning with the failed infrastructure that was being revealed through COVID, right? The fact that we were ill-prepared, totally unprepared for such a pandemic. And really, if you just look at how we treated our healthcare workers alone, right? The fact that we didn't have suits for them, we didn't have masks for them, we were asking them to wear garbage bags to go in and instead of gowns, and also just the fact that we had put no attention on what would happen in this country if there was ever such a thing, and so people were dying in ways that we can't even imagine for reasons that were unnecessary. And then we also had this incredible murder, public, those diabolical 9 minutes of the death of George Floyd, which were catalyzing the reckoning that has been so needed in this country of police murders, of police killings of unarmed Black people, but also the history of this country, going back to the indigenous and the fact that we live on stolen lands, and that genocide was created in order to allow white settlers to come to this country, moving into 500 years of slavery and Jim Crow, and all that was just kind of exploding. And climate change, where the fires were just burning through the West and birds were falling out of the sky. So it just felt like there was so much to be reckoned with, and internally, personally, politically, and they all seem very merged and connected.
Oftentimes I speak to authors who say that they didn't choose the title of their book, that the title was chosen for them because it would help sell the book. But obviously it seems that the title of this book, Reckoning, was quite intentional.
It was intentional because I think we live in a country it's just never been big on reckoning. It's never been big on dealing with where we've come from and harms done and apologies and reparations that need to be made. And even if we look at what's happening now, after that reckoning began to occur, this immense pushback in so many directions, whether it's against not teaching African American history and removing some of our greatest thinkers from that teaching, or banning of books, or this insane new law in Tennessee of not allowing drag queens to be around children. I mean, there is this massive pushback against this reckoning because I think reckonings often bring about transformation and change, and if they were to happen in a true way in this country, they would probably shift power and shift who's in power.
You piqued my interest when you said during the pandemic you had ghosts running around, and it made me think of the way I have defined ghosts, and of course it doesn't have to be how anyone else defines ghosts, but the way I have seen ghosts are actually memories in my past.
Hmm. Definitely. Memories in your past that don't let go, that hang on, that just they come back and inhabit you, night after night until you have to work on them and deal with them and really go into it and see what role you had in things and what anger are you still harboring, which is keeping these ghosts connected to you, or what guilt are you still harboring for things that you could have done better, and I think a lot of our time before COVID in this country was spent for many of us because we grew up in this very heavily driven country, which is always about moving, making, doing, creating, winning, blah, blah, all those verbs. I think to just stop suddenly, screech, brakes, and be confronted with yourself was a very profound thing. And I think a lot of people had a very hard time with it because so much of our practice has been to avoid looking at yourself. And I had a lot of stories in my past. I had a love affairs. I had my parents. I had all kinds of people floating around that I was very grateful for the time to begin to process and deal with. And I feel a lot got cleaned out, and
So you
I
were
feel
you were confronting your own past as well in this book.
yes, definitely. My own past, past lovers, past boyfriends, past girlfriends, past relationships with my own mother, who figures in this book. You know, and also I think past where do we sit in this country in terms of our own personal responsibility for everything? Where do we sit as a white person in this country? Where do we sit as a where do I sit as a woman who's been part of a movement to end violence against women in this country, and looking back at so many of the places and so many of the stories and so many of the women I've listened to, it was reckoning with a lot of that because those stories live in me. They're part of me. So it was a kind of wide scale reckoning, shall we say.
The book is also about writing and the process of writing and what it means to write. As you were spending time, and again, the book is a collection of writings from journals and all kinds of things that you've kept over the years. Did being forced, I say being forced, but during the pandemic, spending time with these writings over the years, did it make you see your past differently? Did it make you make connections that you didn't know were there before?
I think it did. I think I began to see patterns, right? Things that I've been obsessed with and things that I've been interested in my whole life, right? And places I've been drawn to and stories I've needed to hear and particularly around I was thinking how secrecy and not letting people, like I grew up in a family which was very, very violent, and we weren't allowed to talk about it and we weren't allowed to say anything about it. And so like I wasn't allowed to express to really anybody what was happening to me inside that family. And that made me, I see now, obsessed with going to places where people needed to tell their stories, but they couldn't. So I spent much of my life doing that because I felt, well, at least I could do, since I couldn't tell my story, is be a channel or be a support or provide platforms or do something for people who needed to tell their stories so they wouldn't be swallowed up in that kind of silence, which becomes a kind of darkness, where you can't find your way out and there's nobody to help you get out. And so that was one theme that really I saw through the book. And I think there were in terms of writing, what I really came to see is that writing saved my life. It just saved my life. Had I not been able to kind of write my way out of what was happening to me or create another persona who had a perspective on it and who could talk about it and who could create poetry out of it or create magic out of it or something, I would have absolutely perished, either by my own hand or by drug addiction or one of the many things I was doing to self-destruct.
So you're able to draw a line of all the writings that you've done, which is oftentimes monologues and other women's voices. all the way back to when you were a girl and the abuse that you received at home.
Yeah. And remembering when I discovered, like, even just journal writing or the beginnings of writing, that it gave me a way to begin to not only understand what was happening to me, but to process it and also to create something out of it, language out of it, or feeling out of it, or a vision out of it, or something out of it. So it wasn't just meaningless pain or meaningless suffering, and I think that's one of the beauties of art, is it can take something that's so brutal and so cruel and try to create something out of it that is meaningful, or at least interesting, so we can examine it in some way.
What I found touching was the account of your experience in Bosnia, and covering two women who went to work in Bosnia during the war that occurred in the late 90s in that region of the world, and that would actually sort of have a major impact in how you would approach writing and journalism,
Yeah,
and all of these
absolutely.
things.
And interviews, absolutely. I think, I think I when I first went to Bosnia during the war, I don't know, you have this idea of who you're supposed to be. I had never been in a war zone. I had never interviewed women who've been held in a rape camp, and so I had an idea, like, this is how you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be detached, and you're supposed to ask questions. I had a persona, and it was just ridiculous. And I learned very quickly that, first of all, I'm not, quote unquote, a journalist. I'm an artist. And I was there as a human being who cared about those women. And so very quickly, I learned that it wasn't my job to rescue them or save them, but also it wasn't about me keeping a distance from them. It was about me being present as a human being and being in the moment with them. And if they said something that made me cry, I cried, and we cried together. And if they said something that made me laugh, I laughed. And it really taught me that, our job is to learn how to listen. Our job is to really open our capacity to pay attention to people, so they feel seen and they feel heard, and they feel that you are experiencing them in that moment. And the people I've met over these years, these 25 years of traveling the world, they don't want you to save them. They don't want you to give them answers. Sometimes they may want some advice, but mainly what they want is they want you to listen to them. They want you to be present for them. They want you to have empathy for them and feel them. And that allows them to keep going. And that was a big trip, because it really taught me that.
That's interesting and an important thing. But you went there as a journalist?
I went there because I was interested in working on a play
Yeah.
about what was happening to women there. And I had written to these really wonderful women in the Center for Women War Victims in Zagreb, Croatia. And I said I was really interested in really looking at what happens to women who've been in rape camps for a play, which then eventually I did write journalistic pieces about, and I did write other things about. But I wasn't a journalist when I went there. I was a playwright.
And the book or maybe the play that came out of that was called Necessary Targets, a story of women and war. Rarely do I ask authors about the titles of their books, but obviously these are intentional titles. What was meant by Necessary Targets?
Well, Necessary Targets was really a story which is related to what I was saying earlier, which was about two women, one who was a therapist and one who was a human rights worker, who go to Bosnia to, quote, help a group of Bosnian women in a rape camp. And what one woman, what the therapist comes to see is that the women's rage and the women's anger and the women's animosity, she needs to be there for them so they can release what they're feeling. She becomes their necessary target so they can get their feelings out. But what happens to her is that she comes to change and realize that she has to open her heart and be connected and be with these women, because to be in the kind of sea of humanity that is necessary when you're working with people who are in the middle of a war zone and who've been in a rape camp. And the younger woman who goes never really gets there. She stays in her human rights driven objective, detached mode, and doesn't open her heart because of her own necessary. And so the older women and the younger women go through this whole conflict and journey over the course of the play with the women. And I think one of the things I've really come to understand is when you show up and when you listen, um, all kinds of stuff happens. People project onto you. People um, are really happy you're there. Sometimes you become their enemy in their head. Sometimes you become their savior in your head. Sometimes you become their friend. Sometimes you become whatever. But it's just your job to be there and not get in the way of that sometimes, because that's what people need to go through in order to tell their story, in order to get their feelings out, and to not take it personally, and to not react, and to not get into all that, but just to understand when people are in a heightened state of trauma, which people are in those conditions, like all kinds of emotions come up, and it's not about you, it's about what they're going through. And so to serve that experience and be present for that experience is what it's about, not getting yourself injected into the story, keeping yourself kind of, out of their story.
Well, it seems as though their story goes into you, because oftentimes
Yeah.
these become monologues later that you write. Is there a process that happens?
Well, usually what happens is, like what happened with the Vagina Monologues, is I interviewed hundreds of women just to see where women were about their vaginas, what they felt, what they thought. Because whatever play I was going to write, I wanted it to be connected to where women were. And then I don't ever write anything like verbatim monologues or anything like that. What I do is I'll say 15 women talked about having an early experience where they were shamed around sex, right? That came up a lot. Or a lot of people talked about, um, you know, never seeing their vagina, never being able to look at their vagina. So that becomes a theme. And then when I end up writing that monologue, it's it's based on themes, or it's based on things that I've heard, but rarely based on any one particular woman's story. Do you know what I mean? It's like I heard enough women talking to me how hair was an issue, right? But that particular story, that particular thing was made up completely. That was just, and most of the monologues are complete fictional inventions. But what I like to do is know what's in the field, so that I I'm checking in on what's really going on. In the case of the homeless play, the ladies, I spent 8 years working in a homeless shelter, listening to the stories of women there. And so some of those stories were based on things that I had heard, but no real, I invented the characters, I invented different people, right? But the experiences that brought women to shelters, that repeated over and over, that seemed common or seemed really interesting, I would seize.
Yeah, one of concerning the homeless shelter, you have one story, one monologue. You have actually several, but one in particular that they all stood out to me. But one that I have here in my notes is from Nikki. She says it's what happens, and she's a homeless woman. It's what happens when you live outdoors for too long. It all runs together like raw, scrambled eggs. Each part of you bleeds into the other. Your emotions are like your things shoved into one goddamn cheap Woolworths bag. And there's a lot more there, but that was striking to me, especially when we live in an age in which so many people are living on the streets.
I think one of the things, when I worked at the Oliveri Center in New York, when I volunteered there, I think one of the things I was so obsessed with is how your whole life becomes shoved into one bag. And you have to carry that bag, and you have to take that bag everywhere you go, and you can't leave it anywhere, and no one will let you keep it, and it's heavy, and no matter what woman in the shelter, that was the dilemma of her bag, and the nightmare of the bag was the dilemma. And I just kind of imagined what it would be like if a woman lost her bag, and both the horror of it and the relief of it, because it's so hard, to imagine your life has been parceled down into one bag that you have to find a way to live out of and manage out of, and everything's tangled and everything's a mess, and everything gets dirty and it's impossible to clean it, and you don't have the money to do laundry, and you barely can find places to take showers. And you know, I think living in this country as an unhoused person is one of the most painful, humiliating, unsupported, bleak experiences. And the fact that we have so many people living like that, and that we all, and that there are so many people at the top of the ladder who have so much money, right? It really, and if you really let yourself go and hear and listen and sit with and be connected to unhoused people, you understand how easy it is to happen. I remember I met this man who had been like, he had a 6-figure income 3 years before, right? And he was out on his lawn, and someone was driving down the road and they were drunk and they drove up on his lawn and they ran over his son. And that was it. That was it. He couldn't function after that. He lost his wife. He lost his house. And there he was in a shelter. And there he was, not even knowing where he was, because his heart was so broken and he was in so much grief and he had no ability to function. And there was nothing in this country, in this society, in this culture that would say, oh my God, this grief of this man is worth thinking about and stopping our lives for and helping him get through. And so he ended up, and by the way, that's the story with most people. No one's born. I mean, yes, there are some people who are born into unhoused conditions, but most people get there through trauma, through grief, through getting fired from a job and then getting, addicted to drugs because they feel so bad about themselves and they can't get back into the game again. And then the next thing you know, and everybody's got an amazing story of deprivation, of trauma, of not being seen, of not being lifted, of not being, so I have to say those years at Oliveri were life-changing years for me, just really understanding what capitalism and what this country's lack of care, really care, fundamental care for people does.
You see that as part of the patriarchy, the patriarchic system.
I do. I think capitalist racist patriarchy, they kind of go in one breath, but I often believe that patriarchy gives birth to both racism and capitalism because there's systems, right? There's systems of domination. There's systems where there's this fundamental belief that some people are more important and worthy and deserving of others, where there's a central patriarch that is ruling and determining who gets what, and who gets in and who gets out, who's included, who's excluded, who matters, who doesn't. And, we have economic systems based on that, and we have racial discrimination systems based on that, and we have misogyny based on that, and transphobia based on that. And I think at the core of that is a belief that there's anybody who gets to determine that, and the morbid inequality of wealth that's happening now in this country, I think is very much related to patriarchy and a system that fosters this kind of pyramid top where very, very few people end up owning absolutely everything and the multitudes starving,
So that's what patriarchy is when very few or just one person sort of decides for everyone else?
I think it's the domination of the father, right? It's the belief, like in my family, let's look at the patriarchal world I lived in. My father determined what people thought. He had the money. He determined what we believed. He determined, who we were. He determined what we could do. We were under his spell because he had violence, and he applied violence as a methodology to keep us under his spell. And I think that gets just applied in the wider society so that women become second-class citizens, and essentially everybody's a second-class citizen to that white patriarchal dominant force, right? As opposed to living in a world where we live in cooperation and we live in care and we live in where we all matter and we live in inclusion and where we don't keep separating people out. at proving that they're less significant or less valuable or less worthy of healthcare or less worthy of education or less worthy of. I think that idea it stems from patriarchy. Yes.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Tony Award-winning playwright, author, performer, and activist V, formerly known as Eve Ensler, author of many books and plays, and including her latest book that she joins us to talk about. It is called Reckoning. V, I've heard you say in other interviews you will live until the very end fighting against the patriarchy to bring down the patriarchy. What does that mean, and what does that look like?
It's a very good question. I think I think for those of us who've been engaged in a lifelong struggle for the liberation of human beings and the liberation of human consciousness, I think we've come at patriarchy from very many different ways. Resisting it, up against it, trying to invite it to change, trying to melt it, trying to and. Part of me feels like having been involved in a movement to end violence against women for 25 years, that of course we've had incredible victories, right? We've made it so that people care about violence against women and can talk about it, can say the word vagina. We can, we've had great liberatory experiences. We've changed. But the thing about it is that those all feel kind of like one-off experiences when you're still living under the bell jar of patriarchy, because no matter what you do, 50 years later, after we've had abortion rights, they come back and abortion rights are gone, right? Because we're still living in this paradigm, right? And I think, I don't know what the answer is, but some part of me feels lately like, do we now just go and say, let's create the world we want? Let's envision the world we want. Let's become the people we want to be. Let's make it so beautiful and so inviting and so glorious and so comforting and so full of care that everybody leaves this world and comes to that world. I don't know that ramming up against patriarchy and fighting it, obviously we still have to fight for the legislation and fight for the laws and fight for all that. But how do we create a different paradigm here? Is really the question. And how do we dismantle this paradigm at the same time as we're creating the new? And is the creation of the new the dismantling of the old? Is that how we're going to dismantle it? It seems amazing to me that we are here in 2023 fighting for drag queens, right, to have the right to read in libraries. I mean, it just seems impossible that we're here, or that we're fighting for the likes of Bell Hooks and Kimberly Crenshaw and Angela Davis to be taught in our schools, right? Their wisdom is so profound and so necessary for understanding our history. And the fact that the AP history, African history course might, in fact, take them out. Why is that happening? Because we're still within this old structure that can come back at any moment to reassert itself, So I don't know that I have the answers, but I know that I'm really interested in how we spend more time creating another world, create another way of being, just like you are with your show, like bringing new ideas and bringing new ways of being and raising our energy force, raising the energy field so it's higher energy, so that we don't constantly get sucked in to the negativity and toxic world that they're creating.
You referenced that there was a time where we couldn't say the word vagina. That was very much the world that your Vagina Monologues came out of, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
It was. You could not say the word when I started. You couldn't say it on television. You couldn't say it. You couldn't say it just about anywhere. And it's interesting, it's interesting now because people say vagina everywhere, and that has changed. Our vaginas actually do exist, and our vulvas exist, and our clitoris exist, and they're real, and they're not kind of buried in the dark, and we can actually know them and look at them and access them and think about them and actually fight for their safety and protection and health and well-being. And I think that is change. That is change. But I think sadly, there's always this motion. And I think particularly during COVID, because as I wrote in another article in the book, there is something called disaster patriarchy, where these conditions of COVID allowed for the reassertion of a lot of patriarchal domination and patriarchal evisceration of rights. And we see that in the fact that so many girls got taken out of school and won't be returned. And we see that in how many women and children were caught in houses with men who were violent and had no protections and no place to go, right? And we see this in the way women workers were completely exploited during the pandemic without any financial or health support and remunerations. And I think we see that in a pandemic or in any kind of emergency situations, our rights can be set back immediately, right? Because they're not on firm ground. They're not built into a new idea. We're still in the patriarchal mode.
It's interesting then to think about the overturning of Roe v. Wade happening in the same time period.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
You have some writings in the book reckoning about the performance of the Vagina Monologues in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, at the very beginning, when I did perform the Vagina Monologues at a little theater in New York City called Here, which was way downtown, and a wonderful theater which bravely, produced it. Afterwards, people would come and they'd just be these brave individuals who would say, I want to bring you to Jerusalem, and I want to bring you here, and I want to bring you here. And I was like, I'm going wherever people want to bring me, like we're going to spread the vagina gospel everywhere. It's happening. And there was this very wonderful woman who brought me to Oklahoma City. And I kept saying, are you sure we want to go to Oklahoma? She was like, yep, we're going to bring it. I'm going in a warehouse. And literally, I performed it in a warehouse with a little light bulb over my head. But the first night,
you performed it. It was you, because oftentimes there's other people performing it, but this was you.
They performed it after I did it. I performed it for years, and then when I stopped, other people started to perform it. But I performed it, and the first night, this young woman, in the middle of the piece, she literally fainted. She fell off her chair, and we had to stop the show. And she stood up, and just out of her mouth, she said, "My stepfather raped me." And she had never remembered it before, and she had never said it before, and she just said it out loud in front of the whole audience. And everybody stopped. Everybody gathered around her. Everybody took care of her. Somebody got a glass of water. She sat back on her seat. She said she was fine, and I went on with the show. And I have to say that happened quite a bit during the years I performed it. But I will tell you, it was a revelation, because the next night there was a line around the block and people had shown up with their lawn chairs to come and see the show. And I remember thinking, oh, this is everywhere. This is everywhere. This need to tell one's story. And that's when I began to understand how profound violence against women was. Look, I knew I had been the survivor of violence from my own father, but I had no idea of the epidemic proportions of violence against women. I had no idea that 1 out of 3 women will be beaten or raped in her lifetime. It was so shocking to me how many women were lining up after the show, literally to tell me their stories of being raped, of being incested, of being beaten, because they had never been able to tell anybody before. It was an avalanche of stories. And, Oklahoma was one of the very beginning places where I began to see that.
So with the line forming out the door the very next night after that incident of the woman fainting in the middle of the performance, what did it just spread by mouth? How?
It did.
Wow.
And that happened every town I went to. It was just, the Vagina Monologues was so amazing. The energy of it. It was just, it was really a phenomenon. It was like something something happened. Like women were hearing their stories. Women were somebody would, they were like, oh my God, that happened to me. That, oh my God, I have to tell you what happened to me. And I remember because I kept writing it after I performed it here. And I would tell people if they wanted to come and talk to me, they could sign up. And I literally sat in a room for months. I felt like Dr. Ruth. People would come in and come out, and they would just tell me their stories, and they would stay for long periods of time because nobody had ever listened to their stories before. And I felt so privileged and I felt so honored, and humbled that women would tell me their stories and wanted to tell me their stories.
It is interesting to think about the Vagina Monologues before it became this massively known work. That there was another time. There was a time before that happened when it was around.
Oh yeah.
And you were the
Yeah.
one performing it.
Yeah, I performed it off Broadway, then I performed it in London, and then I performed it when we went to off Broadway. I performed it, and then after I stopped, but I also toured America with it for years, and that was just wow. That was just such a profound experience. And I remember I met these two women from Alabama, and they told me they had bought it to Alabama. This was years later. And I said, you bought the Vagina Mugs? And I said, no, no. They said they wanted to bring it to Alabama. And I said, if you bring it to Alabama, I will come. And they did. And I went to Alabama. And I will never forget this as long as I live. There was about 200 people in this audience. And afterwards, I was signing books and I sat on stage. And I think every woman in that audience came up, and I would say 90% of them had been violated. 90%. And everyone had a different story, everyone had a different experience. And I just felt like, wow, wow, what's underneath the story of America, what's underneath the story, when we're going back to reckoning, what we're not talking about, what has really happened, the trauma that's underlying everything, whether it's the trauma of, historical white supremacy, whether it's the trauma of, what it means to grow up in this country as a transgender person, or the trauma of being a woman in this country, of the trauma of being an Asian American. It is so the tar we are living in without talking about it. And it's determining so much of our lives. So doing the Vagina Monologues was a very profound experience because I had access to those stories, and I was seeing, in real time, the impact of women not being able to tell their stories, when they finally got to tell them.
Of course, this is long before we would have the Me Too movement, which it sounds like this is setting the groundwork.
Look, I think we're all part of a chain, right? All movements are part of a chain. The V-Day years are connected to all the women who came before us. I mean, Rosa Parks, right? Before she refused to give up her seat on that bus, was fighting to stop violence against Black women, who were being raped by white men. Right. So I think we're all part of a history of one leading to the other, leading to the other. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of my vivid memories from college, and I did a lot of hallucinogenics in college, so memories are funny. But one of my vivid memories in college was going to see a performance on our campus at San Francisco State University, and this is the mid-90s, the Vagina Monologues. And again, memory's tricky. For some reason, I think you were there, but again, this was more than some 25 years ago, so it's hard to remember for sure. But I just remember how, again, it's one of the vivid memories I have. And it was riveting. And maybe when I try to think about it, why? Maybe it was because it was out of nowhere where this play came from, where we were talking about, yes, the vagina, but also sexual assault, all kinds of things for the first time.
Yeah. No, it was really, I don't know, looking back on it now, like when you're in the middle of something, you don't realize what you're doing so much. And when hindsight is 2020, right? I think I feel like it was such a gift to be able to go to places and kind of uproot and excavate stories and energy, and and where women felt like, oh my God, what happened to me is real and it matters and it did happen and I'm not crazy and I can talk about it and I can share it and I can be in a community of other women. And particularly when the play got taken up by other people to do, in V-Day, because colleges and communities started to do the play in droves, so that everybody was performing that play in their own community to their community. So it was allowing people to know each other and to begin to share stories in those communities, as well as raising money for grassroots groups that were stopping the violence, which was just a beautiful thing.
Did you ever run into difficulty with the performance of the plays? Did people ever show up to protest it or anything like that?
You know what's really interesting? I never, ever, ever had a problem. Um, there were several places. I think a woman got arrested in Turkey. I think there were a couple places where they had issues, but I'll tell you some of the most surprising things. Like I saw the play performed in Pakistan, and the first production was a covert production, but then after the woman produced it, she got brave and they ended up doing a public performance in Lahore and Karachi, and they were very successful performances. So it's been done in places I could never have dreamed. I remember when the women from the parliamentarians from the European Parliament performed it in the Parliament, and you could hear them doing the moans, and it was echoing through the chambers of the Parliament. Or women performing in Haitian women performing in the Haitian Parliament, I've just seen it done in the most extraordinary places, and rarely, I think it's been very rare that there was the Michigan State House when one of the women there was censored remember when she spoke, she said vagina in reference to abortion, and she got censored, and we ended up performing it on the steps of the Michigan legislature, and 5,000 women came, and all of the women who, political women in the Congress and the legislature performed it. It was amazing, right? So yeah.
But to have had your play performed covertly, it seems that may be one of the biggest honors a playwright could have.
The greatest. I think I have a wonderful activist friend in China who told me that the Vagina Monologues has been performed so much covertly in China, and it's given people a lot of strength to perform it there. And I literally cried when I heard that. I mean, the idea that people bravely go out to perform the play and risk all kinds of terrible things happening to them, because if we look at the women in Iran, if we look at how they are bravely, just unbelievably, the courage they have to stand up and fight for their freedom in the face of all the terrible things that are happening to them. And I think our hunger for freedom and our hunger for self-expression and our hunger for the truth, sometimes can overcome anything, because it is the greatest impulse in us to be free, and to tell the truth and have the truth be surfaced in some way,
As we move to wrap up, I hope this is not an off-putting question. I suspect there are listeners out there who are wondering about the name change from V to Eve Ensler.
Well, I talk about it in the book. There's actually a little myth at the end, a little story. When I wrote the apology, which was a letter I wrote in my father's voice to me, apologizing for all the things he had done to me, including the sexual abuse of me as a child, and then later his ongoing physical brutality. I had waited for so many years for my father to apologize to me, and I was sure he was going to do it before he died, and he didn't. And then, you secretly wait, you go to the mailbox, you think that letter is going to be there. Somehow he'll send it from the ethers, and it never came. And then Me Too happened, and all these men got called out, and I didn't see one of them come forward to make a public, thorough, deep apology. And I finally said, I'm going to write my father's apology. And it was an excruciating process, because I had to really climb into my father to try to understand my father, not justify him, but understand him. And that process was so amazing because it allowed me to understand my father. It allowed me to move the father that lived inside me, because our perpetrators live inside us, to move him to a whole new place where he apologized, where he had to deal with what he had done, where he had to grapple with his own guilt and sorrow and all that he had in him that he had never dealt with before. And by the end of that book, there's the last line of that book is "Old man, be gone." I don't know if he wrote it or I wrote it, but at the end he just into the ethers, and I realized he was gone. And I don't have any rancor or bitterness or anything left to my father. I'm not in my father's story anymore. Even being angry at my father was being in my father's story, right? He was still controlling the narrative. And now at the end of that book, it was over. And I realized I didn't want that name. My father hadn't lived his life in support of my, how should we put it? He didn't want me to prosper. He didn't live in a way which he had my best interest. And so I didn't want his name, and I didn't want the name he had given me. And I released it. And I love all things V. V is a beautiful letter because it's so invitational. It's an opening. It just, all good things, so many good words begin with V. It's voluptuous, vagina, vulva, anti-violence. And I have to say, I love the name V now, and I'm down to a letter. Soon I'll be nothing. I think our job here is to keep finding ways to let our egos go and go and go and go until we can finally go into the ethers. And I feel light. I feel light like a V.
Wow. The apology, the significance of an apology, and the significance of the lack of an apology.
I just want to say that I think I can't say strongly enough how essential apologies are. And what I learned in writing the apology is that one of the strongholds, or shall we say columns, of patriarchy is the non-apology. Men are taught from the time they're born not to apologize, that it's a sign of weakness, you give up your power, you humiliate yourself. And so I think patriarchy is to a large degree countenanced on, sitting on the non-apology. But when people apologize, when people go through the deep, it's a deep process of accountability. It isn't just like, I'm sorry I hurt you. It's looking at your history as a person, in your family, in the culture, what made you the kind of person who could do what you did, what went into it, what were all the ingredients of that. Then what is it you did? What are the specific details of what you did to someone? Not, I'm sorry if I abused you. No, you have to go back into that bedroom where you walked in the middle of the night, where you seduced that person, where you took their pants down, where you have to go into detail of what I did. And then what was the impact of what I did? Short-term impact, long-term. How did my actions change and destroy and impact and hurt that person's life? And then taking responsibility for it. To go through that process is not just freeing your victim, it's freeing yourself. When I wrote that book, my father really was present for me. He came to me because I think the dead are often around us, particularly the dead who haven't gotten free, who haven't been released. And my father was stuck in some limbo zone because he had never dealt with what he had done. And what we did for months in the writing of that book is, I really believe I helped my father come to another point in his consciousness where he could be free at the end of that book. But all of us, nobody gets away with doing terrible things that doesn't fill your soul, infect your soul, destroy your soul. And so apologies are the way we clear and clean and transform our souls. And we teach meditation, we teach prayer. Why don't we teach apology? Why don't we teach apology? There are so many people waiting for apologies that would change their lives if someone were to sit and say, I see you. I did what you believed I did. I'm going to take responsibility, and I'm going to break down why I did it, when it happened, how I did it. You're not a crazy person. I really believe there is nothing more significant than reckonings and apologies,
Well,
and that we, this country, must fight for that.
I mean, it sounds like an apology is at the heart of what we started this conversation about, a reckoning.
Indeed, indeed. And I just want to say to the people who are afraid of it, like, once you get into the habit of it, nothing feels better. You want to apologize. You don't want to hold on to your whatever you did wrong to somebody. Look, we're all flawed human beings. That's the nature of being a human being. What we have at our disposal to transform that is apology. And we all have to begin to use it. And I just want to say to men, there's a place for your apology, and it will be welcomed, and it will be invited, and it won't be used against you. You know what I mean? It's your freedom. It's your liberation. It's your ability to move on to the next stage of your own growth and evolution.
V, thank you.
Thank you.
V has been our guest, also formerly known as Eve Ensler. She has joined us for a conversation on her new book. It's called Reckoning.